Hello, I'm Daniel Goldmark, Professor of Music and Interim Director of the Baker-Nord Center for the Humanities. Thank you for joining us for the fourth in our series of 7 virtual lectures this fall. Next week's talk will feature Taylor McClaskey, a doctoral student in musicology, speaking on Cultivating Ecological Consciousness, Pauline Oliveros' Deep Listening as Deep Ecology. For information on this and all of our upcoming events, please visit our website at bakernord.case.edu. It's my pleasure now to introduce today's speaker, Chris Haufe. Professor Haufe teaches in the Department of Philosophy. He is widely published in journals on philosophy and the sciences. He is currently at work on 2 books, one on the concept of fruitfulness and one on the evolutionary nature of scientific progress. His talk today is titled The Hoax and the Humanities. Professor Haufe?
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks to Maggie and to the Baker-Nord Center for hosting this and for their support of the research. The title of my talk is The Hoax and the Humanities. Introduction, The Emperor's New Articles. Imagine a twist on Hans Christian Andersen's classic tale in which not weavers, but writers pay a visit to the emperor, offering to produce journal articles on his behalf. Articles which cannot be understood by the dull and unenlightened. Eager to advance his academic career, the emperor greedily accepts the offer, and the writers set up a sumptuous study in which they appear to be very busy generating profundities. In fact, they are very busy, but with the business of generating nonsense rather than knowledge, wisdom, or insight. The emperor's inner circle periodically checks in to see how things are going. Unable to make heads or tails of the articles, but nevertheless approving enthusiastically, lest they be taken for fools. The finished articles are then shown around to various academic administrators, who, keen to avoid offending the emperor and his small group of initiates, politely nod as they attempt unsuccessfully to understand the meaningless strings of words cobbled together and pressed into a mold vaguely reminiscent of research. In the original tale, the emperor doubles down after being exposed, proceeding proudly and undeterred as the world around him laughs on. I don't think we need to go into a lot of detail here regarding what the moral of this story is. Suffice it to say that it has not been customary to read this as a parable about the importance of standing up for what you believe. In this paper, I want to take a close look at a recent episode in which several deliberately nonsensical articles were published as part of an effort to expose a certain family of humanities subdisciplines as intellectually hollow. This episode is, in fact, only the latest in a series of similar events that now appear to be occurring with increasing frequency. Examining the details of this particular case, I consider various attempts to dismiss the hoax as insignificant. I eventually argue that the general phenomena it illustrates does in fact represent a serious problem for the humanities, but it also suggests the possible form a solution to that problem might take. I do not expect that my proposed solution will convince or even resonate with all of my fellow humanists. Ultimately, though, my primary goal is simply to get us to take the phenomenon of the hoax seriously, because this recent episode is not a fluke, or a failure of the refereeing process, or any of the other excuses to which we might appeal in order to drain it of significance. This will happen again, because it exploits deeply entrenched features of our current culture of research. Rather than dismiss our detractors as mean-spirited lackwits and frauds, as the emperor did, we should pause to ensure that there's something really there. Section 2, the facts of the case. First, the quantitative facts. 3 people co-wrote 20 papers over 10 months. These papers were submitted for publication in, quote, ranked peer-reviewed journals in a field, the higher the better, and at the top of their subdisciplines whenever possible, end quote, none of which was a pay-to-publish journal. Second, 7 of those 20 papers were accepted, one of which received an award as an exemplary piece of scholarship. 7 others were still in play when the hoax was called to a halt. The remaining 6 were, quote, retired as fatally flawed or beyond repair, end quote. I'm quoting here now from the hoaxer's report on the hoax itself. 7 out of 20 papers, that's 35%, accepted after just 10 months of writing. That is a staggering success rate, especially for such a short amount of time. And it is reasonable to assume that at least one of the 7 papers still under review would have eventually been accepted. Second, the context. The authors of the papers, the hoax papers, describe them as, quote, all outlandish or intentionally broken in significant ways, sophistry, and a forgery of knowledge that should not be mistaken for the real thing, end quote. According to them, quote, the goal was always to use what the existing literature offered, to get some little bit of lunacy or depravity to be acceptable at the highest levels of intellectual respectability within the field, end quote. Specifically, the fields of scholarship loosely known as cultural studies or identity studies, for example, gender studies, or critical theory, end quote. Let's take a moment to let this sink in before moving on, because only by appreciating the essential, indisputable facts of the case will we be able to have a productive discussion about its significance. The authors intentionally engaged in sophistry, made ludicrous, depraved, and poorly supported claims, and wound up getting 7 papers accepted in 10 months, including one award-winning paper. By their lights, quote, we shouldn't have been able to get any papers this terrible published in reputable journals, let alone 7. Section 3, clearing the brush. I now want to look at some features of the hoax and the surrounding commentary that have inhibited our ability to sufficiently appreciate what was achieved and why it's important. First, a number of commentators have argued that the hoaxers falsified data and are thus guilty of academic fraud. This is correct. A few of the papers claim to have collected data when in fact no such data had been collected. There's no question that this constitutes fraud, but it would be hasty and unfortunate to simply conclude, based on the falsification of some data, that there is nothing to be learned from the hoax. First of all, many of the papers did not report any data. So even if we decide that there's nothing to be learned from papers that falsify data, that still leaves us with several papers from which we could potentially learn a great deal. In this connection, it's worth wondering whether those papers with manufactured data would have been accepted had they contained no data reports whatsoever. Based on the fact that several data-free papers were accepted, there's good reason to think that the papers with cooked data might have been accepted without it. But in general, the existence of falsified data in some papers cannot impugn the larger study itself. Second, it's worth looking closely at the content of the falsified data claims, because doing so helps to illustrate the nature of some of the problems to which the authors were hoping to draw attention. One paper on dog parks claimed to have, quote, closely and respectfully examined the genitals of slightly fewer than 10,000 dogs, end quote. Think about that. 10,000 dogs. Now, it's neither reasonable nor realistic to expect referees to be able to detect all instances of data fraud, but it is certainly reasonable to expect referees to spot flagrant, statistically freakish claims. The claim to have personally, carefully, and respectfully examined the genitals of 10,000 dogs is implausible on its face. Far less outlandish claims have raised concerns with referees before, and those concerns have frequently led to retractions. This should have been flagged for verification. In fact, according to the authors, a number of the empirical studies reported in their articles were specifically designed to set off alarm bells. The fact that no alarm bells went off is significant. To summarize then, number 1, falsified data only appear in a subset of the published papers. Number 2, there's good reason to think that some of those papers would have been accepted without any data. Number 3, the falsified data were often designed specifically to look troubling, and yet failed to trouble anyone. We can't dismiss the hoax on account of the fact that some data were fake. That's a total non sequitur. We can dismiss the conclusions drawn from the data, but the falsified data simply aren't relevant to anything beyond the inferences they're employed to support. It would be epistemically irresponsible to extend their reach beyond the credibility of those inferences. Just as an aside, I think it's a regrettable feature of the hoax that they faked the data. It introduced a lot of noise and confusion into the study. It is a good way to test whether referees are capable of detecting enormous lies, but it would have been better to have found some other way to do this. Grievance Studies. Another set of confounding factors is the author's professed attempt to test for ideological bias in certain fields and to label that set of fields grievance studies. I think this latter factor is another regrettable choice on their part, since they needlessly generated additional hostility by using name-calling in an attempt to minimize the significance of certain subdisciplines. It may be that the problems addressed by these subdisciplines are genuinely insignificant, but slinging mud is not the way to show that, and it probably alienated audience members who might otherwise have been ready to listen. So bad on the authors for that. The question of whether the hoax does a good job of testing for ideological bias turns out to be much more complicated. To review, for each paper, the authors claim to have been testing one or another version of the following hypothesis. A ridiculous paper will be accepted for publication in certain subdisciplines if it panders to ideologies that prevail in those subdisciplines. What we know is that all the papers pandered to the relevant ideologies and that 35% of them got accepted. We certainly can infer from that pandering papers will be accepted, or even that they will tend to be accepted. Indeed, it's really not clear what we can infer about the causal role of referee ideology from the acceptances, because all of the papers were a combination of two factors: a mimicry of disciplinary language and an ideological spin. If they wanted to test for the causal role of ideological bias, they should have submitted two versions of the paper, one that panders to bias and one that doesn't. They didn't do this, and so the acceptances aren't very informative on the question of whether ideological bias plays a role in the referee process in these disciplines. Having said that, the referee reports, which the authors published in full on their website, do not exactly discourage the inference that being on the approved side of certain social issues elicits positive responses from referees. The referees rarely, if ever, object to the consistently strident ideological tone of the papers. In several instances, referees are explicit about their approval of the social or political stance taken in an article. I have to say that as someone who has refereed a lot of papers and read lots of reports, I was pretty shocked by how blatantly political the refereeing process reflected in these reports seems to be at times. Now, I understand that refereeing is a complicated social and psychological process, and that what referees say to authors is not always representative of precisely what they think about a paper. But if we're going to try to explain away the apparent politicization of the refereeing process, we need some alternative explanation for why referees were so enthusiastic and explicit in their affirmation of the paper's socio-political ambitions. We can't just express a general skepticism. What alternative could there be beside trying to indicate to either the authors, the editors, or both, that the article's political tilt is a point in its favor? Are there different alternative motivations for these comments for each referee, for each paper? That would be a very poor alternative explanation. So I'm not convinced that ideological pandering contributed to referees' favorable impressions of these articles, but I am also not convinced that it didn't. In general, referee reports should be viewed as a unique and valuable glimpse into the epistemology of a discipline. The default assumption is that referees will appeal to a discipline's epistemic norms in arguing for or against publication, and the process is designed to encourage this. Practitioners probably have less motivation to lie in referee reports than they do in any other dimension of inquiry. These reports are a good way of taking the epistemological temperature of a discipline, because referees are charged with evaluating articles relative to the epistemological norms of the discipline. We should treat with the utmost seriousness any trends that prevail in a discipline's refereeing practices. If it looks like there is a tendency for referees to be positively disposed toward an article, based on whether that article subscribes to a certain socio-political ideology, then that is a problem. The imperfections of peer review. Another widely expressed complaint regarding the hoax is that it proves a point that is already universally acknowledged, namely, that the peer review process is imperfect, or that it is not designed to detect fraud, or in any event, the hoaxers have misunderstood the point of peer review. This objection does not hold up under scrutiny. Let's begin by acknowledging that referees come to the refereeing process with a variety of goals in mind. We are looking to see if the research potentially adds to existing knowledge, that is, doesn't reproduce something already on the books. And we are tasked with judging whether some research is important enough to warrant publication, even if it is novel and well done. Some referees and editors take a more constructive approach than others, trying to help develop a piece so that it satisfies the community demands on scholarship. But this is not all that we do. We must evaluate a submission's reasoning, and we must consider any reported results with skepticism. Not blind, unwarranted skepticism, but enough skepticism to discourage researchers from taking shortcuts, being careless, and overplaying their hand. Part of the reasoning behind sending submissions to experts in the relevant area of specialization is that expertise can often be relied upon to detect anomalies in a study that warrant further scrutiny. Because of their highly developed knowledge of certain systems or phenomena, an expert will have an intuitive sense of how plausible a data set is, or how likely it is that the researchers actually obtained the result they claim to have obtained. An expert on randomness, for example, might reliably distinguish a truly random sequence from a sequence that was concocted to appear as if it were a random sequence. An expert on, say, Charles Darwin will be able to tell with high probability whether a piece of correspondence attributed to Darwin is genuinely his. An intuitive ability to sense significant deviations from a system's normal behavior is a big part of what real expertise gives someone and why it is valuable. To say that expert peer review is not designed to detect fraud is perfectly true, but it's also beside the point. Because most research is not conducted in a public setting, there is nothing we can do to prevent fraud in principle. Nor has anyone ever supposed that we could. But to say that it is not the job of expert peer review to spot potential fraud or unintentional error is dereliction of scholarly duty, pure and simple. There is enormous pressure to produce results, and it would be implausible to suggest that a convention of good faith is all that is needed to keep everything above board. The presumption that experts are able and willing to scrutinize submissions is one of the most powerful incentives researchers have to be careful and honest in their work. When it becomes known that expert peer reviewers are not minding the fence, or are not capable of minding the fence, we can expect fraud to occur more often. Next objection, bad faith. In this connection, the last bit of brush I would like to clear relates to the several accusations of bad faith that have been directed toward the hoaxer's efforts. Note that the bad faith accusation raise concerns that are entirely distinct from those raised by the fake data accusations. The latter are about reliability of claims that enlist the fake data for their support. By contrast, the bad faith accusations are concerned with the hoaxer's hidden intentions and lack of sincerity. More than anything, I think the charge of insincerity gives us a glimpse into how important the hoax's accomplishment really is. Interestingly, this is not the first time the issue has come up. A while back, physicist Alan Sokal published what he described as a parody in a cultural studies journal, Social Text, as an attempt to expose the weakness of constraints on what could be asserted in cultural studies. Sokal's article aimed to test those constraints by, quote, employing scientific and mathematical concepts in ways that few scientists or mathematicians could possibly take seriously, end quote, but which he later found were deemed acceptable by the journal's editors. Stanley Fish, the executive editor of the press that publishes Social Text, responded in a New York Times op-ed with an accusation of fraud against Sokal, citing for authority the National Academy of Sciences statement on scientific fraud. Looking at the grounds upon which the charge of fraud rested gives us some insight into the epistemic aims of cultural studies, at least as Fish understands them. Ultimately, Fish's accusation rested on the fact that, quote, Alan Sokal put forward a line of argument he says he never believed in, end quote. Now, in science, fraud can only occur when a report deliberately misrepresents the existence of support on which the report is allegedly based. So, if, one has to misrepresent the existence of support for a claim in order to commit fraud, and two, the charge of fraud is grounded in the fact that Sokal misrepresented his personal belief in his own incoherent rambling, then it follows that for Fish, whether Sokal's claims were properly supported depends on whether he, Sokal, sincerely believed them. There's no question that Sokal did not believe what he was saying, but in order for that to rise to the level of fraud, his sincerity itself must somehow function as support for what he was saying. It should surprise us that the question of whether Sokal's claims were properly supported should turn on how sincere he was in making them. It would be a mistake to think that a scientist's sincerity forms part of the evidence base for her support. Whether her report is properly supported depends on whether the data she alleges to have obtained in support of it, one, actually exist, and two, are judged to be probative. For Stanley Fish, however, the fact that Sokal's conclusions can't be relied upon turns on Sokal's insincerity. But that's just wrong. What makes Sokal's conclusions unreliable is that neither they nor the premises on which they are based make any sense. Nothing about the seriously flawed or erroneous data contained in his publications would have been affected had he been sincere. The same holds true for this more recent hoax. What exactly is the significance of the fact that the authors did not believe the nonsense they were writing? Indeed, if they were trying to make ridiculous or meaningless claims, as Sokal did, it should count in their favor that they did not believe them. The fact that other people found value in the hoaxer's intentional nonsense would seem to reflect poorly on the receptive audience, not the hoaxers. To see how irrelevant the bad faith charge is, let us try to think about what would have to be different in order for the hoax's project to have been done in good faith. Literally nothing, except that they would need to have believed what they were saying. But maybe they did. Maybe it's actually a meta-hoax, where they claim to have been insincere, but were in fact perfectly sincere. Or What if an army of scholars came forward and announced that they never believed the stuff they were saying? Not that their data were fraudulent, no worries there, just that they personally did not believe the inferences that there were drawn from them in the work they published. Or alternatively, recall the 2016 dust-up around a paper on feminist glaciology that was suspected of being a hoax until the author publicly confirmed his sincerity. What difference do the author's intentions make to our warrant for accepting those inferences? That warrant is determined by our appraisal of the relation that the evidence bears to the conclusions. Our warrant is not affected by what the authors think about the data's relation to the conclusion. Imagine if we found out that Pythagoras did not believe his own proof of the Pythagorean theorem, yet in any case chose to promulgate the theorem. Would that cause us to second-guess the theorem? Of course not. Would Pythagoras be guilty of fraud? Of course not. We can look at the premises and decide for ourselves whether they support the conclusion. This is research, not confession. The author's sincerity or lack thereof is simply not relevant. The bad faith objection is a last-ditch effort to avoid the obvious and most damaging implication of the successful hoaxes, namely, that maybe the only difference between real scholarship and nonsense in certain disciplines is whether or not the author believes what he's saying. If he believes it, it's genuine research. If not, it's parody. The bad faith objection is a tacit admission that, in these disciplines, we cannot tell the difference between real scholarship and sophistry, and that we need the authors to promise that they are being genuine. It's crucial to appreciate that this issue simply does not arise in every discipline. Yes, we need researchers to be honest, but what we need them to be honest about is the existence of their data and the methods they claim to have used in collecting it, not whether they believe their sentences to be meaningful. The question of whether a researcher is being honest about their intentions or similarly irrelevant details of context doesn't enter into the assessment of an argument, and so we generally don't worry about it when we're evaluating research. And it's a good thing, too, because the broader context of inquiry is incredibly messy. Consider the simple fact that many research projects have literally hundreds of contributors. Do we need assurances that they're all motivated by the same good faith intentions? Well, they're not. I can guarantee that on any particular research project, there are several investigators who think that the research problem is just plain stupid. They're simply following a protocol. To appreciate the irrelevance of contextual details that do not affect the reliability of the data, consider these few excerpts from my favorite Twitter feed, Overly Honest Methods. Quote, "We used that technique because my student had a crush on the technician," end quote. Next one, "Incubating your ELISA plates an extra 3 hours just because that's the time it took to see Ghostbusters." Next one, "Sample was warmed to approximately 37 degrees Celsius in my armpit." Finally, "Sections were 6 microns thick because I am not skilled enough with a microtome to cut 5 micron sections." See, in these cases, nothing changes when we find out that, for example, technique A was used because of a student's love interest. It's mildly entertaining, but it's irrelevant to our assessment of the research. For what really matters is that technique A was used, not why. If we are worried about the efficacy of technique A, our worries will not be quelled by the confidence of a particular researcher. Contrary to what the bad faith objections presume, then, there is no blanket assumption in research that all claims are made in good faith. The good faith assumption is very narrowly restricted to claims about what data there is and how the data was obtained. This restricted scope is entirely appropriate because the communal growth of knowledge requires that we be able to rely on others' data, and only the researcher knows for sure whether she is accurately reporting her observations and the methods she used to collect them. But the communal growth of knowledge certainly does not require that we be able to rely on others' inferences from the data. Unlike the raw data themselves, the validity of an inference from data is something that is available to anyone who bothers to scrutinize it on the printed page. We do not need inferences to be made in good faith, because knowing that an argument is sincere or insincere cannot help us distinguish warranted claims from unwarranted ones. Nor do we need to know whether a particular author thinks that the issue they are addressing is of major intellectual significance. Both of these issues are settled at the community level. If we find ourselves wondering whether an author is sincere before we make up our own minds, something has gone badly wrong. A variant of the bad faith objection might prove tempting. This objection goes as follows. Just because the authors attempted to generate meaningless sentences does not imply that they were successful. It is possible to produce meaningful sentences by accident. Therefore, it is possible to accidentally produce articles that are worthy of publication. I first want to acknowledge the possible cogency of this objection. There is some room for debate as to whether, say, an inscription or an utterance can carry meaning despite a lack of any such intent on the part of an author. Whether, for example, a bottle of ink that is spilled a bottle of ink that has spilled in such a way as to accidentally form a series of marks that looks just like the English sentence, "Snow is white," whether that spill carries meaning in the way ink marks would have had they been written out that way by the author. If such accidents of meaning are possible, then accidentally publication-worthy articles are apparently possible. Ultimately, I think this objection, though, does more harm than good. If things have devolved to the point where we are attempting to delegitimize the hoax by insisting that the authors might have failed to produce nonsense due to the fact that semantic content is partially determined by interpreters, we have arrived at a very dark place. Indeed, the objection really misses the forest for the trees. The relevant concern should not be whether accidental meaningfulness is possible, but what it says about our disciplines and our intellectual integrity if we are willing to defend our peer review system by appealing to the possibility that sometimes sentences can be meaningful by accident. If the peer review process is to have any intellectual significance, it should at a minimum be able to distinguish between accidentally and intentionally coherent sentences. Final section, revitalizing the humanities. Let us try to imagine an alternate reality in which the humanities are glorified as the pinnacle of intellectual achievement, while the sciences are maligned and distrusted, practitioners having to beg for the cultural table scraps that are too insignificant for humanists to bother with. This happy scenario, if it is a happy one, is no fantasy. As Rachel Loudon shows in her review of Histories of Science to 1913, the genre of history of science arose in the 17th century through practitioners' attempts to demonstrate the legitimacy of science and mathematics as species of knowledge, as a way of, quote, pressing their claims against humanist dominance of the institutions of intellectual authority, particularly educational institutions, end quote. This largely successful campaign was achieved by writing narratives of progress, stories about scientific communities' confrontation with and eventual victory over challenging intellectual puzzles, whose importance was carefully explained to a scientifically uninformed readership. By describing and explaining the science's history of progress, practitioners were able to impart to readers a sense of how, historically, difficult problems have been chipped away at and eventually solved to the satisfaction of communities of specialists. These causal histories of science would subsequently give rise to attempts to formulate abstract characterizations of how the sciences produce knowledge, because science's demonstrated knack for solving extremely difficult problems naturally engendered a desire to know the secret to their success. While histories of progress per se are probably not the right model for how to articulate the value of the humanities, there's a lesson in these efforts to convince a public skeptical of the legitimacy of scientific knowledge. Ultimately, what impressed readers about the history of science was not merely that it had produced lots of important results, but that it produced lots of important results that were very difficult to obtain. The argument for increasing the representation of the sciences in curricula rested precisely on the fact that producing scientific knowledge required lots of training in the particular cognitive tools that have been successfully employed in its pursuit. No one would have been motivated to devote more instructional time to science if scientific knowledge was easy to generate. Perhaps more than any other theme, the history of science showed that there's something special about these tools because they are causally responsible for science's impressive history of solved problems. If we see value in that history of success, went the argument, we ought to embrace the value of learning the skills on which that history depends. And if we value learning those skills, we need to devote an appreciable amount of an individual's education to them, because they do not come easy. The lesson for us humanists is that if we want to convince a general public that it is important to devote serious study to the humanities, it had better be the case that whatever is valuable about the humanities can only be obtained by devoting serious study to it. And if that's correct, it ought not to be the case that the production of humanistic scholarship is utterly trivial, that, for example, someone with zero training in a given humanities discipline could win awards for their exemplary scholarship, as has happened in the Hoax. As a general rule, when we see that people with no training in a discipline can simply cobble together some jargon that survives multiple rounds of expert scrutiny, we should question whether the production of knowledge in that discipline requires any training whatsoever. To put it another way, we should wonder whether there is any meaning to the notion of expertise in that discipline. After all, if expertise in that discipline is not required to produce knowledge, and if it's not an effective tool for vetting knowledge claims, precisely what is it that distinguishes someone with expertise from someone who lacks it? And what exactly is the argument for why anyone ought to devote serious study to the body of work in that discipline? If even professional grade scholarship can be generated not just by a novice, but by a novice who is trying to sound ridiculous, why should anyone waste her time immersing herself in that discipline's literature? Part of the reason the sciences continue to demand a major investment of students' time, even at the undergraduate level, is because everyone knows that professional-grade scientific research cannot be generated by a novice, let alone by a novice who is trying to sound ridiculous. The things we find valuable about scientific inquiry are hard-won. Professional scientists know this. Aspiring scientists know this, and they are reminded of it several times a semester when they get their graded exams back. Because there is no shortcut, they invest thousands upon thousands of hours into acquiring and honing the tools that will allow them to contribute to scientific knowledge. No discipline whose professional research standards can be routinely met by people with no disciplinary training can expect to make similar demands on students' time. It's crucial to separate this point from the regrettable fact of contemporary life wherein students seek scientific training because they think scientific training will give them a better chance at getting a good job. Suppose that the fortunes were reversed. Right? Suppose that students thought that being a really capable humanist was the only way to get a good job. The point would still stand that, apparently, being a really capable humanist requires no training. And if producing award-winning humanities scholarship requires no training, surely no training would be required merely to appreciate humanities scholarship. Unlike in science, the range of shortcuts here is ostensibly limitless. It could be that much of the reason why the humanities are currently undervalued is because much of the time they do not appear to pose genuine intellectual challenges. Rather, they pose pseudo-challenges. They demand that aspirants adopt a certain manner of speech or use of certain en vogue terms. To be fair, the sciences also make demands on our language. As Michael Gordon has recently shown, those demands have increasingly come to favor native English speakers. They used to favor those who knew Latin, and before that, Arabic. But they also make demands on capacities that are not dependent on language alone. Demands on our analytical, logical, and computational capacities. Demands on our capacity for abstraction. On our ability to creatively solve problems and to develop technology to assist us in the process. These are challenges that no change in language can solve. They are real, and they can only be confronted by strengthening the non-linguistic tools that their solutions require. There are plenty of humanities subdisciplines that pose genuine intellectual challenges, and it would be both unfortunate and grossly inaccurate to infer from the success of the hoax that the humanities, by their very nature, pose no genuine intellectual challenges. The subdiscipline with which I am most familiar, the history and philosophy of science, is one domain in which genuine challenges are in ample supply. Understanding the historical development of scientific and mathematical knowledge requires lots of different kinds of competencies, most of which I lack, by the way. But it is worth noting that in the last 50 years, the discipline has gradually moved away from the study of scientific mathematical ideas themselves to a nearly exclusive focus on the sociocultural aspects of scientific inquiry. This shift has been correlated with a decline in historians of math and physics and a rise in historians of biology, medicine, and social science. These developments are related. It is very difficult to do anything interesting about the history of math and physics without knowing math and physics. But it is not very difficult to do research on the history of biology, medicine, and social science without knowing these sciences. This is because the latter possess many connections to sociocultural issues, whereas math and physics relatively less so. Since it is easier to become proficient in the sociocultural issues of the day than it is to become proficient in mathematics and the sciences, recent generations of historians have opted for the former. The results have been uninspiring, as was lamented in an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education a few years back. History departments have gradually seen less and less need to hire specialists in the history of science, since the history of science can now be researched and taught by people who do not understand the science. The weaknesses exposed by the hoax are not limited to the specific subdisciplines the authors targeted. Quite generally, we have not been sufficiently attentive to our duty to distinguish between important and unimportant research problems, and we are failing to impart a faculty of discernment to our students. We have been increasingly lax in our responsibility to bring clarity to complex and nebulous problems that fall within our purview as humanists. We have increasingly come to favor novelty over depth, because it is always easier to meet the loose standards for good work on a new topic than it is to meet the standards for good work on a well-developed area of research. It is not always laudable to ask a question that no one has ever asked before. Some questions are just not worth asking, or at least they're not worth asking in a research context. We need to return to the level of rigor and intellectual seriousness that defined the humanities from ancient times until relatively recently. If our distinctive contribution to human culture is going to be valuable, we need to hold ourselves to an intellectual standard that can only be met by seasoned specialists. Being good at humanistic research has never been easy. Let us hope it never becomes so. Thanks. I am supposed to get notifications. Okay, so I have a question here. The question is, at what point were the accepted fake papers withdrawn, before or after publication? If they were published, did peer readers catch the hoax? The accepted papers were drawn, most of them were withdrawn after they had been published. Yeah. If they were published, did peer readers catch the hoax? That I'm not aware if peer readers caught the hoax. That is, I assume by peer readers, we mean people who read the articles after publication. Yeah. That I don't know. I don't think it was known at the time, and I don't know whether that's been followed. That's worth looking into. Okay, next question. Would a series of AI-generated papers and theories, not merely a few coherent sentences, be a hoax if they passed peer review and contributed to science? Yes, I would say they would be. In fact, there are a couple of AI like paper generating engines that you can use online. There's one for computer science. I've seen one for a paper in the disciplines that the hoax was targeting. Whether any of those papers have anybody's tried to get a paper to pass peer review using those paper generating engines, I don't know. I think it's worth a try. I mean, it's possible that people have tried and just not reported their failures. I mean, that would be significant, right? And it's too bad. It would be too bad if we didn't know that people had used these engines to generate papers and then failed to get them accepted for publication. Would it be a hoax if they passed peer review and contributed to science? Well, yeah, I mean, that's, I guess the nature of the contribution would matter, right? Earlier in my talk, I mentioned an objection to the hoax that targeted, that questioned whether they could be sure that their claims made no sense. I think let's assume it's in principle possible to make a claim, to produce a sentence or an utterance that is just totally meaningless. Right? The paradigm for a syntactically correct and semantically dysfunctional sentence, right, was Chomsky's colorless green ideas sleep furiously. So let's accept for the sake of argument that that sentence and others in that family don't make any sense. The question is, could they still contribute to science, to the growth of science or to the growth of another body of knowledge? I think so, but it would have to be through means of an accident, right? Right. That I mean, arguably, the sentence "colorless green ideas sleep furiously" has contributed a lot to the growth of our understanding of human language. Well, maybe not that sentence by itself, but that approach. So, I mean, there's certainly a sense in which, there's a clear sense in which a meaningless sentence could contribute to scientific knowledge or to another body of knowledge. But I think that's a very special case, and right, in fact, it's not an accident, right? The fact that it is meaningless is what makes it valuable to the growth of our understanding of human language. So that's why that's a very special case. In another context where people are just producing nonsense and somebody is somehow inspired by that, I would say that's certainly possible, but it would be totally serendipitous. It's not, and it's not something that we think would promote the growth of scientific knowledge at the rate that we've seen, or any significantly similar rate over the past 350 years. Next question. Is there something inherent to the review process in the humanities versus, say, the physical sciences that made the review hoax more likely? I think that there probably is. I don't know if it's inherent specifically to the review process. So, as I said earlier, this is one of the questions that the researchers were interested in is the review process tainted by ideological bias? I don't think the studies do a good job of showing that the review process is tainted by ideological bias for the reasons I outlined in the paper. I don't think that we have any hard data on whether ideological bias is prevalent in humanities peer review, or is more prevalent than it is in the physical sciences. So, I can't really speak to that. I think that, ultimately what the hoax tried to do was to mimic the typical paper that is published in one of the journals that they submitted to, without much thought into what their claims meant. I think that if the fact that this hoax succeeded and that this is becoming almost a routine occurrence now, this happens every year, it seems now, suggests that there must be some problem at the level of peer review. It could be that the peer review suffers from a more general problem that plagues the humanities. That's my personal view. I don't think there's anything specific to peer review in the humanities itself, although, I don't know if, we'd need to look more closely into the question of ideological bias, and the hoax does not give us any insight into that. Last question. How much do you think the hoax was based on an implicit critique that cultural studies is too broad, too inclusive, or just not a real discipline? I mean, looking at the papers that were published and their kind of commentary on the experiment, I guess I would say that I don't think it's based on a sense that that cultural studies is overly broad, or not a real discipline. I think they just thought it was intellectually hollow and that they could show that by producing articles, meaningless articles. And that the reason that it's intellectually hollow is not directly related to its breadth, although its unusual breadth may be a consequence of that, as viewed by the hoaxers. But no, I don't think that that's at the core of the critique. The core of the critique is the intellectual content itself, and not its range per se. Next question. Do you think that the immaturity of a particular discipline makes the discipline more vulnerable to less rigorous review of its scholarship? Yes, I do. Next question. But can the history of science really, it's not quotes, it's italics. Can the history of science really be done well by someone who doesn't understand how to do the science well? How can they pick apart cultural forces from forces inherent in the scientific paradigm itself? Well, I mean, I think that the meaning of, or kind of the remit of the discipline of history of science has evolved and expanded significantly in the past 40 years, 45 years, such that it now legitimately includes consequences of scientific research, right? Or the political use of scientific ideas, or that a work like that would legitimately fall under the purview of history of science as it's now conceived. No, I don't think, because of the degree to which history of science has expanded, I don't think that that one necessarily needs to really have a strong grip on the content of scientific ideas in order to write a very, intellectually respectable and rigorous history that would appear to fall within that discipline. I mean, now some people might say, well, that's not, that's just not history of science. But I mean, that's just not how the discipline conceives of itself now. And so, I think that it's up to the practitioners, the community members, right, to kind of determine the bounds of the discipline. Okay. Next question. While this hoax was specific for humanities, how would a similar hoax that attempts to reveal the preconceived biases of scientific researchers be reviewed by scientists or the public response? And what similarities and differences would be likely to the humanistic hoax. That is not a question that I'm really equipped to answer. It's hard for me to imagine a parallel phenomenon in the physical sciences. I don't think it's impossible. But I think it's just much harder to produce significant scholarship by accident in some disciplines than it is in others. And I mean, I would have to think about how such a hoax would work. I mean, it's significant that, I mean, this is happening with some frequency now in different humanities subdisciplines. It's significant that the only case in which this has even, which this question has even arisen, is one in which most people don't think it was a hoax at all. It was just bad papers that, or a bad paper that that passed peer review. And the authors are adamant that that their publications were not hoaxes. So, yeah, I mean, I think that we could, as I said early on, we can expect this to keep happening. I have every confidence that this won't be the last hoax by any means. You know, if it were possible to do in the sciences, I think that it, you know, what is preventing it? You know, it's a good way to test the strength of the peer review system, for one thing. You know, and if it happens in the sciences, we'll definitely hear about it. As I said, this one possible case, which I think the record shows it pretty clearly is not a hoax, received an enormous amount of attention in the press and on the internet, much more so than the humanities hoax I've described. So there's every reason to think that we'll know if somebody pulls something like this off, and then we'll have to see what made it possible. It's clear what the causal mechanism was. I think it's clear in the case of this and previous hoaxes, and yeah, it will be. If and when it happens, it will be instructive. Okay, I think that's the last question. Thanks so much.